Hello, I'm Hannah Donnert with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. She enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnerships, calls, webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Che's third webinar in the series Agents of Change in Environmental Justice. Our moderators today are Senior Agents of Change Fellows, Max Aung and Lariah Edwards. Dr. Aung is an assistant professor in the Division of Environmental Health at the University of Southern California Keek School of Medicine. Max is an alumnus of the Agents of Change in Environmental Justice Fellowship, as well as the RWJF Health Policy Research Scholars Fellowship. Max's research focuses on applying data science frameworks to understand potential mechanisms linking chemical mixtures to health across the life course. Max also draws on his background as an immigrant and first-gen graduate to leverage research and policy frameworks to reduce environmental health disparities among historically marginalized communities. Dr. Edwards is an environmental health scientist with years of experience critically evaluating toxicological and epidemiological data for the purpose of understanding health effects associated with exposure to environmental chemicals. Currently, Edwards is a postdoctoral scientist working jointly at the George Washington School of Public Health and the Environmental Defense Fund. At GW, Edwards is working with Dr. Ami Zoda in the Environmental and Occupational Health Department, where her research focuses on exposure and hazard consideration of chemicals found in food and beauty products. At EDF, Edwards works with Dr. Jennifer McPartland, where she supports scientific advocacy efforts related to evaluation of chemicals under the Toxic Substance Control Act. Edwards earned her doctorate in environmental health from Boston University School of Public Health in 2019, and a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. In addition to her postdoctoral work, Edwards was also a Spring 2021 Agents of Change and Environmental Justice Fellow. We will leave time following the presentations for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions to the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentations. After the presentation or our panel discussion, our moderator will read out questions for our speakers to respond to. We'll get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who have called in on the phone, we posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on our webinar right now is muted with the exception of our speakers. This webinar is scheduled to last for 75 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. So with that, I'll pass it off to you, Max.
Thank you, Hannah, for that really great introduction. And hello, everyone in the audience. It is so great to be here with you today on behalf of the Agents of Change and Environmental Justice Fellowship. I'll take a moment to talk a little bit more about our program, just to give you a little bit of background information. So I wanted to highlight the entire team of staff that supports this program, which includes our founding director, Dr. Ami Zoda, and our editor, Brian Bienkowski. We're also supported by Dr. Yosita Ornelas Van Horn, who is also an assistant director, as well as our program associate, Summer Ahmad, our assistant editor, Hannah Seo, and our digital comms assistant, Aaron Gomez. As I said earlier, co-moderating with me today is senior fellow Lariah Edwards, and this program has been generously sponsored by multiple different organizations, including the Marisla Foundation, the Forsythia Foundation, and the Passport Foundation, as well as Beauty Counter, Rachel's Network, Broadreach, and the Tides Foundation. So reflecting back a little bit on the history of the program, it was initially developed to address a major problem in higher education, which is that the culture of science is rooted in Eurocentric, white, and patriarchal systems. And the problem with this is that it fosters structural racism and sexism in academic and scientific institutions. It also impacts the type of science that is being conducted, and it contributes to scientific and medical mistrust within society. And overall, it does not fulfill the science society contract. So to overcome this problem, one of the major solutions that we can pursue is to amplify neglected voices in environmental and climate sciences and help foster a new generation of more diverse and inclusive thought leaders. So to pursue this, the Agents of Change and Environmental Justice Fellowship empowers emerging leaders from historically excluded backgrounds in science to reimagine solutions for a just and healthy planet. And to meet this, the fellowship cultivates environmental justice leaders. It injects new ideas in environmental health and climate fields. It increases environmental justice literacy among STEM students and scholars, and it makes scientific information more accessible to marginalized communities. A little bit of background about the fellowship. We have supported 31 doctoral students, postdocs, and early career scientists so far. And these fellows come from marginalized backgrounds, including first-generation college graduates, individuals from communities of color, and individuals with disabilities. And you can see here that our fellows span a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds, from environmental health all the way to microbiology. The structure of the fellowship is that it is a 9-month fellowship co-led by Dr. Zoda and Brian Bienkowski. And for this fellowship, fellows are required to write a first-person narrative essay. They are required to participate in the Agents of Change podcast and attend monthly virtual meetings. And they're also expected to produce at least one episode of the Agents of Change podcast in collaboration with another fellow. And another part of the program is to develop a science translation product focused on educating community groups or policymakers on a particular issue in collaboration with other fellows. And for this fellowship, there are some eligibility requirements, which include that you need to be pursuing scientific work that advances environmental public health, environmental justice, or ecosystem and climate health and justice. You also need to be an early career scientist, and this is defined as either being a doctoral student, medical student, or postdoctoral scientist, or an early career practitioner, which is defined as someone working in advocacy, government, research, or the private sector within less than 5 years since earning your terminal degree. You also need to come from a marginalized background or population that's underrepresented in science and academia. And some of these examples include being a first-gen college grad, or coming from a lower socioeconomic background, individuals from communities of color, or individuals with disabilities. And you need to also be based within the United States, but applicants do not have to be US citizens. So I just wanted to say that the call for applications for the newest fellowship is open right now. So if this program is of interest to you and you meet these eligibility criteria, I highly recommend you checking out the program. The deadline is April 15th. And with that, I will hand it over to Lariah to kick us off for today's really great webinar and theme.
Thank you so much, Max. I am excited to kick this webinar off and showcase our wonderful senior AOC fellows. So to get us started about this webinar, really we're focusing on toxic chemicals. And really it's a global problem. The scale of pollution in our environment is quite frankly massive. And while chemicals are used throughout different areas of our lives and different products as shown in this figure here, and they provide benefits, they're coming at a cost to our health, to human health, and also environmental health. This figure here really highlights all the ways that chemicals are embedded throughout our lives. And it also estimates the deaths associated with chemical pollution, in this case, chemicals that are used in trade, chemicals that are in the soil, that in the water we drink, in our food and products, and all of these different areas of our lives that then get into our body and impact human health. And this figure here really focuses on death. It doesn't even really consider or showcase how many of these chemicals we've come to find out are associated with numerous adverse health effects. So when we think about, who's at risk to suffering diseases or adverse health outcomes when being exposed to these chemicals, it's not just us looking at the one chemical or the environmental exposure per se. We have to think about those that may be particularly vulnerable, people who have certain factors, certain social vulnerability factors that make them more at risk for being experiencing health effects. So for example, people who live at the front line of a community, who live right next to a facility and experience high levels of exposures to certain chemicals, or those that have underlying health conditions such that a chemical exposure will further exacerbate their underlying health outcome and put them at greater risk for health concerns. And so really when we think about chemical exposures and different social vulnerability factors that a lot of people in our country experience, really you see there's this concern for environmental health disparities. And when we think about a problem this large scale, a problem that is in fact global and really is creating these public health disparities, such large scale problems can't only be solved by one person or one sector, as we're going to get into today. It requires a combined effort of multiple sectors and peoples and groups, in this case, communication, practice, research, and policy to really address these environmental health disparities and environmental justice issues. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the senior AOC fellows that'll be featured on our panel today. First up is Michelle Jin. She is an environmental health supervisor and community outreach and engagement specialist at the Ramsey County Public Health Department. And she's a health communicator with interest in toxic chemicals and consumer products, and redesigning systems to educate and change behaviors. Next, we have Dr. Theresa Guillette. She's an environmental health scientist at Arcadis. Her interests are on PFAS fate in transportation and groundwater ecological risk assessment and developing PFAS remediation solutions for impacted sites. And finally, we have Annie Huang. She is a doctoral MD candidate at the University of California, San Francisco. She is doing research on policy and advocacy work on methane chloride deaths in the workplace. And now, since we've introduced our speakers representing different sectors, we'll go ahead and jump into our questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Lariah, for that really great overview of today's theme. And I'm so excited to have each of the panelists here. You all represent such great experiences and expertise. And so I'm really excited to hear about, your insight on this particular problem. So I wanted to kick off this panel by first asking Michelle a question. So regarding toxics in the environment, state and local government must respond to federal regulatory mandates, and it also closely sees the problem on the ground. So in your experience, what have been some of the challenges with working at this interface, and what types of projects have you worked on to address environmental contamination?
Thanks for the question. Having served at both the state level and the local level, I've experienced the varying challenges in these two levels of government. During my time at the state with Minnesota Department of Health, I worked on trying to prevent exposure to inorganic mercury that can be found in some skin lightening products. Skin lightening products are widely used among our communities of color all around the world. A challenge in that work was that many people may not know they've been exposed to mercury. Part of this issue comes the fact that mercury is not reportable. It's not built into the system of something that we're monitoring. So there isn't a system in place that requires mercury screening and reporting, not in our child wellness visits, like where we have children having their blood levels tested for lead, not in our prenatal visits. It's hard to know who has or has not been exposed, which means people may not be getting follow-up guidance that they need to reduce their exposure, their urine mercury levels, and to live a healthier life. Without screening, home visits, and reporting built into the healthcare system, individuals are slipping through the cracks. The multidisciplinary team that I was a part of continues to work at changing the system. It won't be an easy task, but through policy change, funding, and awareness, it is possible to make mercury reportable in Minnesota, maybe one day throughout all the US. Now I currently serve at the local public health level at Ramsey County in Minnesota. Being at the local level, our work engages with community members more directly and regularly than it did at the state level, at least in my experience. One challenge I've seen from an environmental health and justice perspective is that there may be more pressing issues for a person and their family. Some of the work I do now includes promoting how to safely dispose of household hazardous waste. What that is, it's like items that include your paint cans, vaping devices, skin lighting products containing mercury, antifreeze, insecticides, and so forth. However, this may not be high on the priority list for many families when competing with other issues that need more immediate attention, such as food insecurity, stable rent, the cost of childcare. Though a challenge that we're seeing at the local level of how do we talk about household hazard waste and proper disposal, there is current work exploring within our county a wellness and community hub concept that our residents could leverage for our community navigator model and add additional public health services, such as our human service programs, including behavioral health and environmental health. So it's exciting to see a holistic approach. All that to say, both at the state level and at the local level, there are challenges and efforts to change the system to reduce our human environmental health impacts from toxic chemicals, one way or another, like whether it's gonna be through policy change, procedural changes, or how we care for the entire person. So a little bit from the government side.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That is very insightful, and it's really great to learn, I think, for some of the audience who are, especially trying to better understand how that actually operates, like at the local level, and how that interfaces with larger scale environmental policy.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Michelle. So we're gonna move it on to hear from the rest of our speakers. So on to Theresa. So Theresa has a background in academia and also in consulting, as do I. So the collaboration with academic and consulting experts has the potential to really spark innovation and really address issues, especially when trying to address exposure reduction, risk mitigation for emerging chemicals like PFAS chemicals, which are widely talked about now. Theresa, can you talk about your recent experiences working in this intersection with PFAS, and why is this chemical so important? We see it everywhere. And can you speak a bit about, how your collaboration with Arcadis and your background in doing a postdoc in government has been useful for addressing this problem?
Thank you, Lariah. I'd be happy to. So PFAS are an important class of chemicals to understand because they're known to be highly persistent and mobile within the environment, as well as bioaccumulative, meaning they can build up at quite high levels in both our bodies and in the ecosystem. They're also associated with a number of different health effects, such as increased cholesterol levels, higher risk of kidney and testicular cancer, changes to liver enzymes, and decreased vaccine response in children. Given this weight of evidence that determines that PFAS are potentially harmful to humans and the ecosystem, I've chosen to pivot my career from determining what risk PFAS may face to health and focus on remediation strategies for their cleanup in the environment. In my previous professional experience as an ORISE fellow at the EPA, one of my main research projects was mapping the extent of PFAS contamination using geospatial technology within the environment to inform researchers about their occurrence and fate and transport within groundwater to communities. I also collaborated with a few labs at NC State to understand the body burden of PFAS in impacted communities. After this, I realized how pervasive PFAS contamination within the world is and really wanted to shift towards finding solutions for their removal from the environment. Even if we turn off the tap and stop all PFAS production, there's still the issue of how do we remove these compounds from the water, from the soil, from the sediment. Even issues as small as how do we properly clean out impacted piping from storage systems that have used PFAS firefighting foam. If we switch to new foam, doesn't that just get contaminated? So all of these things really take innovation from our academic collaborators, as well as the ability to put these new strategies into practice and scale up. I love being able to collaborate with a team of engineers, chemists, geologists, and biologists to really deliver quality solutions for PFAS remediation at impacted sites.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a lot. I've always been hearing about a lot about PFAS chemicals in the news right now. And Do you get a lot of questions about people asking you how you can avoid PFAS given your line of work?
I do. Actually, at our consulting firm, we too work with a lot of different product stewardship solutions to try and understand where PFAS might be in specific products and kind of give the consumer some more information on that.
Awesome. So this next question is for Annie. So researchers continue to find substantial evidence in various different epidemiologic cohorts that toxic chemicals, including the one that you focus on, methylene chloride, has been influencing health across the life course. So in your perspective, what are some of the major challenges in addressing this problem in clinical settings? And what are some areas that you see the clinical field has progressed on this?
Yeah, so I guess in regards to the major challenges in addressing the problem of toxic health in the clinical settings is, I think the most practical issue is that clinicians are quite downstream. By the time you come to us, you have a problem, and we're very good at trying to fix the problem and manage your problem, most likely. But because we're so downstream, the most effective way to address the issues of toxics and PFAS, as Theresa was mentioning, is to actually prevent it in the first place, which as clinicians we can't really do as effectively, at least within the realm of the clinical setting. Uh, what was mentioned before about PFAS is that it raises your cholesterol. You're going to come to us with high cholesterol and we're going to give you a statin or something to lower it down, or maybe give you some lifestyle modifications. But given the chemical exposures, you're most likely going to be managed pharmacologically, for example. If you're coming with, testicular cancer, guess what we're going to do? We're going to take it out. And that's what we're going to focus our energy on, is all of those downstream effects. Same thing with kidney cancer. Um, you know, if you're coming in with renal cell carcinoma, we're going to take out your kidney, for example. And so I think in the clinical setting, we're a little bit more focused on how do we manage all of those downstream effects. And so, but the most effective way to address the problem is obviously to prevent it, and it requires more collective action, and more collaboration, which is what I think we've been alluding to, and more and kind of systemic change and policy change that's very much upstream of the clinical environment. And that kind of weaves in, I think, to some of the more I think progress it is in that vein. So I think we've done a lot of strides in medical education, for example, in teaching kind of the next generations of medical providers about toxics, about that intersection of toxics and health, and how that relates to clinical medicine. So we've done a lot of strides on that, I think, at the medical education level. And then I think in terms of research and advocacy, obviously a lot of clinicians are also have their hat in research as well, with their clinical experience and the data that comes from the clinical environment, that can be used to inform policy, and more systemic change. I think we've done a lot of strides in that, as well as advocacy, using our voice to, and obviously we're going to speak more about the science communication piece as well, and being more active in that space, and being more active. And for my work in methylene chloride, for example, by the time you come to the clinical environment, because of your exposure to methylene chloride, you just had a heart attack, you just had a cardiac arrest. That's just bad. Or you just had a very rare cancer, whether it's lymphoma or gallbladder cancer. So, the goal is to make sure no one really gets to that stage in the first place. And so doing a lot of advocacy work in terms of talking with folks at the EPA, for example, is something I've been very much deeply involved in. Supporting grassroots organizations, people really doing the work on the ground in terms of getting the chemical out of your local hardware stores, because that's going to make the biggest effect. Is so kind of that so both kind of upstream and downstream effects. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie. I'm always amazed at physician scientists and advocates who are at that intersection. And I am really excited to, to see how you continue to pursue that leadership as you grow into, your post doctoral career. And I think it's great. You and I have both interfaced with research at UCSF, and so it's really great to hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely. And I think your response was a great segue to our next question, talking about, for all our panelists, actually, how do you envision leveraging your current or future work to pursue environmental justice for toxics and health? And why don't we start with Michelle, if you don't mind giving your perspective on that?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about my current work. So within Ramsey County, I'm part of a team that's right now working to redesign how do we think about reducing, reusing, repairing, recycling practices, our community, really trying to be much more inclusive and accessible, and household hazardous waste. The part that I'm leading is integrating community space and educational resources into a facility that will make these practices accessible while reducing what goes into the waste stream, as well as proper disposal of household hazardous waste products so they don't go into our water, our soil, our air. Beyond that, I look forward to seeing where life will take me and my passion for health, equity, and environmental justice.
Thank you. Theresa, same question to you. How do you envision leveraging your current or future work to pursue environmental justice for toxics and health?
So yeah, my previous experience in assessing PFAS exposure within communities and the ecosystem really made me understand that these aren't just numbers on an Excel spreadsheet. These aren't just graphs in a manuscript. These are people, their families, their pets, they're even baby alligators. So having this knowledge and keeping it at the forefront of what I do really makes me work harder and bring my best self to every project. It gives me motivation to find equitable solutions for surrounding communities and help with education and awareness to these groups. One of my fondest memories of the past year was helping to bring together graduate students and impacted community members through a science communication event in collaboration with Green Science Policy, Silent Spring Institute, and Dr. Jamie DeWitt of NC State Superfund, and a team of other scientists. We called it PFASCom, where community members actually judged graduate students on their ability to communicate science clearly and with compassion. I'm a huge fan of scientific communication and firmly believe that we're stewards to society and should always strive to educate, but never talk down or dismiss community concerns. Communities are living through this and they deserve our respect as well as the transparency of the scientific process.
I love that compassion piece. I think you're right. You hit the nail on the head. It's so important to be able to, accurately give back feedback and results, but also keep in mind that this is their lived experience and it's hard for them. Annie, you touched a bit on, how you plan to pursue future work with EJ and toxics and health. Do you want to add anything else to that?
Sorry, I couldn't get the mute button fast enough, but yeah, I mentioned about obviously continuing to engage the EPA on more systemic policy change and further supporting grassroots organizations. But as far as anything else in the future, I'm kind of in that transition stage in my clinical career and medical education, where I'm kind of moving to the next phase of my training, which I'm very excited for. But that also means I have no idea what's about to come up, where I'm going to live in the country, just based on how our training works. And so we'll see what ends up happening in the next couple of months.
I get it. It's exciting and nerve-wracking all at the same time.
Yeah.
Great. So this next question is also for all of the panelists. Since the Agents of Change Fellowship Program is open for applications right now, I wanted to take a moment to get you to reflect a little bit on how the program has impacted your ability to communicate about toxics and health, and if you could speak on some of your experiences and how the program might have changed your perspective on science communication. And we can go ahead and start with Theresa this time.
Thanks, Max. So honestly, this program gave me a lot of much needed self-confidence to pursue my passions of both communication and remediation. I really tend to get in my head and felt like in previous postdocs, I was a complete outsider and was just bumbling over my words. I really didn't see anybody like me in higher ed positions, at least where I was at currently, nor in positions of leadership. And this made me feel like I didn't belong, like I was part of the problem. Meeting Dr. Zoda, as well as the amazing cohort within this program, gave me the space to be myself and receive and give constructive feedback to become a better communicator. I left these monthly meetings feeling just so energized and really appreciated the professional development opportunities provided by the program. It always, when you come into diverse groups, it helped change my perspective on what is equity within science and how we should aim to provide space for really diverse communities and views. And kind of bringing home this fact of like only through working together can we truly solve some of our larger challenges within the environment. As touch base on this webinar now, that's going to take a multi-sector approach. And this old viewpoint of us in industry versus them in academia is really outdated. We really need both to drive innovation as well as create constant communication between government and NGOs and community to challenge and bring down these structures that have not really helped us in the past.
Wow, thank you so much, Theresa. That's really great insight. And it does really drive home this idea of collaboration, especially as each of us start to enter into our, careers and thinking about how we can work together on this. Michelle, do you want to reflect a little bit more on some of this question as well?
Yeah, so I'd say Asian Change, it really gave me a platform to share my voice, like literally my voice, on a topic that predominantly impacts our underrepresented communities. The podcast is it's a different way in how we engage with each other, how we promote our work. You can hear passion in someone's voice. It's different than reading a research paper. I find it more engaging. I find more people interested to want to learn and hear. During the fellowship, one of my favorite things was meeting fellows and speakers, connecting with these individuals beyond the fellowship so we could work collaboratively, share ideas, just opening up those doors. It's building the network. I also really love that I had an opportunity to amplify another person's voice, and you'll eventually be hearing their podcast soon once it gets published. I really just, it's broadened my perspective during the fellowship program, because environmental health, there's so much under that umbrella beyond the work that I do, that I got to learn about all my other fellows and their work. And I just loved that. It was a fantastic fellowship in a unique way for health communications, because I do health communications in my professional job, but podcasts are not so much the norm, especially in the government world. So I really did appreciate that opportunity, and still trying to make pushes and using that medium. So, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, the podcast has been, very popular. I think a lot of folks are listening in, and it to me also was a really unique new way to to explore science communication. So Annie, do you also want to reflect a little bit about this question and about your experiences with the fellowship?
Yeah, I mean, on reflecting on this question, I definitely echo the point about self-confidence. I think that is I don't think that could be overstated. I think at least I definitely needed the confidence boost in terms of believing that, hey, I have something to say and I have an expertise that is worth sharing. I think in terms of the importance of science communication, I definitely have learned the value of taking us out of the confines of the kind of the formulaic research paper. You have this like special chance this kind of unique chance to editorialize. Basically, you kind of take that discussion section in that research paper and just bring it out alive, because those are all the points that you think are important and are willing to kind of hit home to either listeners or readers, and also connect with folks outside of academia, outside of the scientific bubble, outside of the ivory tower, quote unquote, so to speak. And so I think that lesson and perspective is super valuable. And I think in terms of like being in this fellowship, it has never been so timely. I think we're in a unprecedented public health crisis that shows how important science communication is, and communication is in general to the public. And so it is certainly, I think, timely in that respect.
Thank you, Annie. And I also just want to say that it's so great that this fellowship has expanded to this scale now, because it's allowed us the opportunity to create this affinity group on toxics and health, and also have this multi-sector perspective, because as the program continues to grow, I think we can all not only work together to more effectively address these problems, but also, work together to pursue really impactful science communication and communicate with policymakers and community members. So altogether, I'm very optimistic, and you all give me a lot of hope for how we can continue to expand the program. So with that, I think we can enter the, yes, Lariah?
I might want to jump in since I'm a senior fellow and talk about what the program, how it's impacted me and my thoughts on science communication. Echoing Annie's point about self-confidence, I feel like that can't be said enough. Really, this program kind of gives you that platform to speak, and it pushes you to do it in something that isn't a journal, something that is a little more transferable and translatable. And I think in this program, I have learned how to better communicate science to people in my life who aren't scientists, like my family and my friends. And this is timely given COVID, because you had so many family and friends asking me questions about COVID. Not that I study, infectious diseases or no vaccines, but they had questions, and I was the only public health person that they knew. And this program teaches you how to communicate science to someone who isn't, in your field, doesn't know your jargon. So you're pushed to really understand and know what you're talking about, so you can make it easily understandable for those that aren't necessarily in your field or, also scientists. And I think that was a true strength moving forward. Even if I continue just publishing in journals, I at least have this confidence that I know I can speak to someone in the media or a close friend or a colleague who isn't necessarily in my area of expertise. And Max, as a senior fellow at AOC, what are some of the things you've walked away from this program with?
Yeah, thanks for chiming in. I think for me, I entered the fellowship as a postdoctoral fellow, and it was so great to have the space to interact with other fellows and really gain feedback from them, because I think ultimately it really enhanced my ability to communicate some of these complex scientific studies that I focus on. In these large cohort studies, we're trying to translate complex information about chemical mixtures, molecular pathways, things that are not very, generalizable to ordinary conversations with community members. And so I think it's been really great to, pursue that connection of translating some of these research findings. And for me, it's been a great honor to sort of return back to the program now as an assistant director. And part of my mission going forward with the program is to think of ways to connect all of us together, all of the senior fellows together, and think about new opportunities to continue advancing that frontier of science communication.
That is awesome. And I love the idea of trying to connect fellows together. Since I've been in this program, the podcast comes out, the essay comes out, and your name and face is everywhere, thanks to the wonderful AOC team that markets all of our deliverables. And I've had a few students in environmental health and, in their undergraduate years reached out and say like, oh, I saw your podcast, and I read your essay, and I just want to connect. I'm interested in that, interested in this or in that. And there have been some instances where I'm like, oh, your interest, I'm glad you're reaching out. Like, I don't have experience in this area of research, but I know of someone else who's AOC fellow. Maybe I can connect you with so-and-so. So I love this idea of building this network of people who aren't usually in our field, and kind of creating this way to keep us all connected, kind of so we can help each other.
Yeah. Have other folks had these experiences where, through this fellowship, you've been reached out to, or, other connections have been made from folks that have read your pieces?
Yeah, I had a couple of undergraduate students reach out and just kind of ask a little bit of how I got into this field, and talk a little bit about the program as well, and how useful it was to both my professional development, as well as just kind of getting myself out there and out of our, ivory towers. So I think programs like this create visibility where people of color can feel like they can do it. And so I think that's really powerful and really great for students to realize.
I'd like to second that. Within the government field of environmental health, underrepresented groups are not there. It is a white male dominated field, and it's a hard one to break into. Opportunities like this is something I'm trying to gear more individuals in my sphere towards, just so they can gain that experience, gain that confidence, because we need to have more representation within this, because research is important, government's more, like, all of it's important. And if one sector is not representative, it's not going to be as helpful to the multidisciplinary approach. So that's something that I'm excited that this exists. And I've had some individuals inquire a little bit about it. Just gonna feel for, like, what is it like? Because I will admit, when I first joined, I did feel like a little bit of a black sheep. Like, I'm not working on postdoc. I'm not doing in-depth research. I do translations of what the toxicologists say so the general public can understand it. And even so, it was a wonderful fit, and I'd encourage anyone interested to apply.
Excellent. Great. So I think at this stage, we could probably enter into the question and answers from the audience. So if you're tuning in and you have some questions for this group of amazing panelists, please feel free to submit questions into the chat. And I'll go ahead and kick us off. One of the questions we have is, given that misinformation is increasingly being recognized as a problem that public health scientists and clinicians must contend with, do you have any thoughts on how we can better prepare the next generation of scientists to counter misinformation?
I have thoughts on that one. Having, like, for example, worked the COVID-19 response at the health department, definitely saw a lot of this. And from our perspective, reflecting back on this and still today, so much of it comes down to communication. People are like, it's so confusing, the guidance that's being said. The science is always changing, and the science is changing because we get new data, and we understand that. But for the general public, that is a confusing message. And some of the ways and strategies I've seen is a lot of it's gaining trust within communities that your expertise means something, that it's not just I believe or don't believe. And this comes with developing relationships. It comes from breaking out of the ivory tower or my cubicle land to being in the face with public, to engaging and developing that relationship. But also with, I think, the communication side of that, a big lesson learned is science so much comes from the perspective, like I think of like research papers, there's always a section about limitations, and it's because we're making sure it's clear these were the limitations within our study and so forth. For the general public though, that is very confusing. And it's, I think about always like whenever bringing up materials, it's how would I communicate this to a third grader, to a sixth grader, depending on what my audience level is. And how do you make it, how can you also prepare someone for change? How do you make it so that guidance 3 months from now may be different from today, and that needs to that's understood and can be accepted. So it comes down to communications and trust.
Excellent. Thanks, Michelle, for that really great insight. Does anyone else have any reflections on that? We can also,
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think too, really training our next generation of scientists to be very critical about the data that we both generate as well as put out there, and just be very careful and transparent about our process. Because a lot of times, at least when I'm talking to community members, they don't really understand why the science changed. And it's like, okay, well, you know, it's a little bit of a process, so we have to take the time to figure that out. But explaining that in a way that's understandable, I think, is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of data, it's also, you know, great to think about opportunities where we have a lot of data that exists, and how can we leverage some of that so that, you know, we can be more efficient with addressing problems in a timely manner as well.
Definitely echo kind of Theresa's point about critical appraisal. I think we get I think we all get training in that, as we know from like our journal clubs, where you just sit there for like an hour and like, how do I tear this paper apart sometimes, that we do kind of internally amongst ourselves. But when that is kind of taking, when, especially during this particular public health crisis, when that is kind of publicly done in front of the public, that can be very confusing to people. Kind of to other people's point about how can the science change. Kind of the other thing that's kind of tangential, but also kind of related to the misinformation point, is like, you know, scientists are not a monolith. Unfortunately, there are very factions even within the scientific community, and everyone has their own, even along the same set of data, people will have different interpretations. And I think, how do we go forward in continuing to have that debate? I think that debate is healthy, but how do we make it productive for everyone involved, and kind of less divisive, and kind of more conducive to progress, especially since, you know, especially if it's taken, especially for the whole for the whole public going forward.
Speaking on that, I've definitely seen how I've seen like social media and Twitter be really excellent tools to helping, you know, combat misinformation, almost like right when something is posted or someone puts something out there. But it's using these tools carefully and making sure not to, you know, further the flame of misinformation, but, you know, being mindful and respectful, but also, you know, acknowledging when this is wrong and this is what the facts say, and this is what we currently believe, you know, given the state of facts we have at this moment. I have a question for our panelists. How have you found, like the whole, you know, topic of this webinar was to think about, you know, multi-sector perspectives, and really that leads to collaborations across sectors and different disciplines. How have you guys found those collaborations to be? I know you're earlier in your career. Have you started establishing such collaborations with people in, outside of your sector? And, what have you learned from some of these collaborations?
I've learned that communication goes both ways. If you really need to just be open and put yourself out there sometimes in the collaboration, but also build trust within it as well. And so I think it can be really hard because, right, like in this age of not really seeing each other in person, not really going to conferences and kind of scribbling ideas on napkins anymore, you have to really work a lot harder at creating that communication line. And so I think that is a large part of it, of collaboration, is really just talking.
I'd agree. I mean, the building relationships outside of your field is so important, and not just when you're looking for something. It's planning far ahead to be building those relationships for one day when you may want to be asking for something. But in that meantime, you're there to ask, what do you need? What support can we provide you? I think about so often going into if you're doing community assessment, you may be going in with the idea like, I want to assess your need for X, Y, or Z, but really community is going to say, no, I don't really care about household hazardous waste right now. I care about not having a roof over my head, and recognizing that these things are all interconnected, and being able to be there for what your community needs. And then eventually there is going to be that tie back that may be more closely aligned to your niche type of work. And that can take years of building relationships. And I love that, because then I have people that I can easily contact and say, hey, so-and-so at FDA, I've got something I want to run by you. Or my community partners who manage businesses for our Munger Somali community can reach out to them and say, did you know about this? That's like maybe not related to my work, but someone else's, but it's keeping that relationship and showing that you care and are present. And therefore they'll be much more likely to be there and present for you when you need it.
Yeah, kind of echoing that. You really can't do environmental health and justice work without a cross-sector collaboration. Like, it's impossible. There's no way. And so, without kind of, looking at industry and academia and medicine and government, like without all of these players, it's really hard to move anything forward. So you're kind of forced actually to speak to each other. And I think that's one of the things that really attracted me to this field. In particular, is that opportunity to collaborate, if not just out of necessity as well, in order to move things forward. And even within the field of medicine, I mean, I'm going to be, an emergency medicine physician, and I'm going to need to create, speak to other specialties with regards to future work on environmental health and justice. And so it's at the end of the day, it's all very exciting.
Excellent. So we have one question from the audience in regard to communicating with, traditional media and reporters. How has the fellowship prepared you to, potentially engage in these types of conversations in terms of communicating your research findings or the work that you do with media? And I'm not sure if any of you have already worked with media before, but this, if you can also shed some light on that.
Yeah, we did actually have, I think in the July sometime, we had a couple of people from, I think, Science Communication Network come in and speak to us. And that was really great for trying to understand what works well with talking to journalists or talking to TV or things like that, because you really want to choose your words wisely. You don't want, just like we were talking about misinformation, right? You don't want something that you say to get twisted in a way that wasn't really understandable or not where you were going within that story. And so I think it's really important to just understand what you're saying and how that can be translated.
Excellent.
I've also had some experience, just talking with the media, and I will say getting that training is very, very helpful. I come to find that it was a different way of thinking about how to, talk with the media. You want to give the headlines and the top results first, and then go into more detail after. And it was a different way of thinking than when you're sitting down and writing a paper for a journal article where you want to lay out everything and then get into your problem. So I think it requires practice. And I think, and this is another instance where self-confidence and having support from those that know you and from your supervisors is vital to really help you communicate well, because the last thing you want to do is go out and say something that you then regret, but then it's out there for everybody to see. I'm curious, Michelle, in your role as a health communicator, were you nervous at first when you had to maybe speak to media? If you've had to, like, how did you overcome that? Or did you have, maybe you're just smooth sailing the entire time?
I was actually trying to think of the first time I had to start talking to media. It was probably my undergraduate years. So that's actually really don't remember too much. I think it's times where I've spoken in media, and I've done media at the international level in foreign countries. So I'm getting questions translated. And I think some of the things that I identified of how did I succeed in that? It is knowing your content, and everyone here is going to know their content well if this is your research. But also knowing how do you translate it, how do you say it in a way that a child can understand it, because we need to use plain language and get out of our jargon. And also being able to stay on point. I think with media, those questions can easily diverge, and you want to stay on point. Is your point to say that, oh gosh, I'm blanking on an example right now, but like you have one message, and then like think of this like some prior training I had, you have like these 3 points of your triangle, and there are 3 main key messages that all come back to your main point that you're trying to communicate. And so whenever a media person is asking you a question, you tie it to one of those 3 areas to bring it back to your main point, to keep it focused on what you're trying to say, because media can sometimes diverge it down another path. And I think I've seen so much among all the other fellows. We're passionate about that work, and it comes out. And when you get to speak to the media like that, it is very beneficial. I think also when you're able to be in your space. So I'm trying to think of in some of the early essays I remember when reviewing during the fellowship. I loved it when there were photos of people in community demonstrating their work, because it was so much easier to visualize and see the benefit in the community who's benefiting from this, rather than like our sale profile photo. So being able to communicate goes beyond our verbal words. It goes through images, because images can really transcend that and connect with one another.
Great. So we just got a question in the audience asking about, this individual stated that, training the next generation of diverse professionals can be somewhat depressing sometimes in terms of toxics and health because of the daunting scale of this problem. And, asking how can we bring hope and a focus on solutions through our work. And I'd like to take a moment to, reflect on this question. I think, for the past year, I worked at the interface of science and policy at UC San Francisco, and really learning how to, identify the levers of change within society, and thinking about how civic engagement and translating findings can advance policy. And I think that's one of the things that now as a faculty member at USC, I'm hoping to expand on, and thinking of ways to train the next generation, because I think there's a lot of optimism for me personally when I can see a path forward for training new students and researchers to not only be exceptional scientists, but also think about how can they interact with policymakers to essentially take their scientific evidence to inform policy, and advance more health protective regulations. Does anyone else have any reflections on that? On what types of things are you optimistic about, and what brings you hope in some of the work that you do?
I think what brings me hope in some of what I do is seeing and interacting with some of these graduate students and undergraduate students, and they're just so aware of the problems, aware of things going on that I don't feel like I ever was when I was a student. And I think that brings me a lot of optimism that our younger generation genuinely cares about what's going on, say, for instance, climate change and all of the activism going on for that. I think that brings me a lot of hope that it's okay to be different. It's okay to change things. It might take a little bit of time, but we shouldn't lose hope.
Thank you. Another question for the panelists. What do you see as emerging problems or threats in this area of toxics, equity, and health that we need to prepare for?
First thing that came to my mind was actually Teresa's your work, rubber chemicals. I think about in our health department, those are things that we're talking about is what actions are we taking? What can we do? How much can we still prevent? But when there's already so much out there, what is there for remediation? What is there for who's being most exposed? What is the long-term plan when we also live in a society where long-term planning can be very challenging when you have changing governments, when you have your elected officials changing so frequently. The tension tends to be on issues that someone can demonstrate, hey, I made change in the last 2 or 4 years. While this is something that's going to be much longer, and it's going to require a lot of work. That was the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, and building off of that, Michelle, in my work and my research, I think a continuing problem and emerging issue that we face is trying to better understand the cumulative effects of multiple chemical stressors. So, we have PFAS, but then we also have exposures to toxic metals and other plastic compounds such as phthalates. And collectively, these chemicals can influence multiple different health outcomes. And so trying to understand that the breadth of their health effects in combination is one of the major challenges, because not only is it very expensive to do biomonitoring studies in epidemiological cohorts, but it's also complicated to understand the data behind these exposure assessments. And, I think that will be, that's the frontier of research right now, is this, large scale exposome approach of trying to understand these chemical mixtures.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Max's perspective, especially in the sense of, I feel like this keeps on happening, right? From DDT to PCBs to PFAS, we keep on putting things out there that have a really long shelf life. And so maybe we should think about, how do we actually make chemistry work for us and actually create some sustainable solutions? I'm really a big fan of green science and trying to do better from the beginning. So I think there's a lot of history that we can draw on from our previous scientists like Rachel Carson and others to really give us that perspective to do better.
Awesome. Well, I think we're about at time to hand back off to Hannah to make some closing remarks. Thank you everyone so much for your really great insight.
Great, thank you so much. We're approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on CHE's website soon, and tomorrow you'll receive an email containing a link to the video. The next CHE Agents of Change webinar will take place on March 31st. Fellows will discuss community engagement and environmental health. To learn more and to RSVP, please visit our website at healthandenvironment.org. Additionally, if you are interested in applying for the Agents of Change Fellowship, you can find details at agentsofchange.ej.org. Applications are due April 15th. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. If you appreciate the CHE webinars bringing the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank all our moderators and all of our speakers here today, Max, Lariah, Michelle, Annie, and Theresa, for taking time to present. Thank you so much for joining us. We're wishing all much health and wellness, and hope to see you soon.